Today we're going to be looking at the Roman civilization. Before we start looking at the Roman civilization, we need to become familiar with the geography of Italy. So let's take a look at this. Italy is the peninsula that is boot-shaped that sticks out from the underbelly of Europe. It sticks out into the middle of the Mediterranean Sea, and it looks like it's kicking the island of Sicily. That's that boot-shaped figure there, and Sicily is the island right off the tip of the toe there. This is to the west of Greece, which is the civilization that we've just been studying, the Grecian mainland with the Peloponnese Peninsula and the chain of islands that all make up the Greek civilization is to the east. In between them, between Italy and Greece, is the Adriatic Sea. And of course, the playground of the Greeks was the Aegean Sea to the east. That's where all of those islands are in their island chain. And then to the east of that was Anatolia, or sometimes referred to as Asia Minor, which at this point is being dominated by the Persians. We have just completed studying how the Greeks had taken over the Persian Empire, and we will see the Greeks basically in control of the eastern portion of the Mediterranean, while the Romans will vie for control of the western portion of the Mediterranean. Let's look at our timeline. Here we go. So we've been studying the ancient civilizations. First couple of chapters, we looked at the Sumerians, the Babylonians, the Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Neo-Babylonians, and the Persians. And as the Persians moved west, they came in contact with the Greeks, and that was the classical, we began the classical time period or era that makes up the Greeks and the Roman civilizations. The Romans are going to basically be from around 753 BC, the founding of Rome. April 21st is considered the founding of Rome, until about 476 AD, when the western portion of the Roman civilization will collapse. The eastern portion of the Roman civilization will continue in the form of the Byzantine Empire for about another 1,000 years, but we'll talk about that later. Let's take a quick look at the Roman civilization here. We're going to look at a little bit of prehistory. The Trojan War is going to be during this time period. We're going to look at the journey of Aeneas to Italy. And we're going to be looking at the writings of Homer, who's going to give us the Iliad and the Odyssey. We'll look at the basic Roman civilization historical time period from 753 to 476, which is divided into three sections: monarchy, republic, and empire. As we zoom into this a little bit more, let's take a look at what we'll be looking at. For the monarchy, we'll be seeing again the founding of Rome in 753 by the very first king, Romulus. We'll look in that into a little bit more detail. We'll look at the last king of this time period, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, which he will be run out of office in about 509 BC. And then we'll move into the second era of Roman history, known as the Republic. And this is going to be characterized by a lot of expansion on the part of the Romans. They'll expand through the Samnite Wars, battling against another tribe in the central Italian peninsula. Eventually, they'll take over the entire peninsula and then begin to wage war, basically three wars over the course of 100 years against the Carthaginians. We call these the Punic Wars. And when it's all said and done, the Romans will have mastery of the western portion of the Mediterranean Sea by 146 BC. There's going to be a lot of problems, however, internally in Rome, and this is going to result in some attempts at reforms to fix some social and political issues that were beleaguering the Republic. We'll have the Marian reforms, which will end up leading to the Solomarian civil wars. There'll be two of those. We're going to have the first triumvirate, which will end in another civil war, most famously with Julius Caesar in the middle of all of this. He'll be assassinated in 4 BC. We'll see a second triumvirate with a resulting civil war, and Augustus Caesar becoming the ultimate leader and the emperor between 31 and 27 BC. That will take us into the third portion of the Roman historical time period, known as the Roman Empire. And we'll have such emperors, renowned emperors like Tiberius and Caligula, Claudius, Nero. These are figures that are quite prominent in Roman history. We'll be talking about Christian history as it pertains to this era in Roman Empire history. We'll be looking at the first and second Jewish revolts, the destruction of the Jewish temple, the catastrophic destruction of Pompeii by Mount Vesuvius in 79 BC. We'll look at some additional emperors from the 2nd century AD, and then, of course, the imperial crisis of the 3rd century. That's going to be quite a critical time period for the Roman Empire. And then we'll follow that up with the final emperors, Diocletian and Constantine, and those that follow after them as the empire splits into two, Western and Eastern, and eventually the collapse of the Roman Empire from various problems, internal and external, but most pressing was the movement of tribes from Europe into the Italian peninsula and bringing it to an end in 476. So let's take a look back at our geography, so we kind of get a sense of the timeline of what we're looking at here. Let's take a look at this geography a little bit more detail. We'll just zoom into the Italian peninsula. Now, just at face value, you can see very quickly that the peninsula, obviously, by definition, is surrounded by water. So a lot of coastal land, a lot of coastline that the Romans will also become very adept at trading with those around them. And another characteristic that is very prominent in the Italian peninsula is the mountainous region that runs down the spine from the northwest to the southeast, the tip of the boot there. This is the Apennine mountain range, and it essentially divides across the spine, east and west, Italian peninsula. To the north, sort of the cap of this boot, are the Alps mountains that separate Italy from France and Switzerland, or modern-day France and Switzerland. And just on the south side of the Alps is the Po River Valley, and the Po River that runs through that valley, emptying into the Adriatic Sea. And right in the middle of this boot is Rome, situated on the Tiber River. So these are the major geographic features of the peninsula itself. Again, there's Sicily at the tip of the boot, major island that is basically halfway, or between, I should say, North Africa, Carthage, which is a people group that the Romans are going to have a lot of interaction with. We'll be talking about them in a few minutes. And between them and the tip of the boot, you can also see two other major islands, Corsica and Sardinia, that will be prominent in Roman history as well. So very mountainous, but I want you to note this is different than the Greek mountains. The Greek mountains were such that it really divided the Greek city-states, and they never managed to really unify into a central polity, a central state body. So they were all very separate. You had the Spartans and the Athenians and the Corinthians, the Thessalonians, etc. And they just all were very divided because of the mountains and because of the nature of the island chains, all being separated by islands. But Italy, even though it had a significant mountain range, didn't quite seem to keep it from unifying into a homogeneous people group and polity known as the Roman Republican Empire. Also, there's quite a bit of fertile plains that's going to play into Rome's agricultural sort of endeavors, and so quite fertile lands throughout the peninsula. And the result, of course, and we also mentioned, of course, the coastal plains. The result of this, of course, as I mentioned, there's going to be unity, which is different than Greece. There's going to be lack of that. They're going to have an agricultural economy in Italy, and of course, sea trade will be very important. So Italy has good farmland. Unlike Greece, its geography did not keep them from expanding and uniting. The Alps, however, were very important, and so was the sea, in deterring outsiders, for the most part, from conquering them. There will be some times where they are invaded and conquered, but for the most part, the Alps was a significant hindrance or border to people moving south into the peninsula from Europe. Now, there's a couple of toponyms or names that you're going to want to be familiar with. We've got Latium in the central part of Italy. This is where we get the name Latins or Latin. This is where the Romans will come from. To the north and west of them is Etruria. This is the homeland of the Etruscans, which will be very prominent in early Roman history. And matter of fact, Romans will get quite a bit of their culture from the Etruscans. South and east of Rome is Campania. And let's see, some significant cities. There's a whole bunch of cities, but I just given you about 4 of them here that you'll want to know. Rome and Pompeii, of course, you're probably familiar with. Brundisium is on the heel of that peninsula boot shape. And then Carthage, which is not a part of Rome or Roman Peninsula, Italian Peninsula, but it's a competitor that you're going to want to be familiar with. It's Carthage on the little promontory that sticks out from North Africa into the Mediterranean Sea. And Carthage and Rome will fight for control of the western part of the Mediterranean. And of course, you've got several major islands that you'll want to know: Sicily, Corsica, and Sardinia. So those are names you're going to want to get in your head. A couple of bodies of water, as you can see here. The Po River, which we've already mentioned, coming out of the Alps Mountains, flowing across the Po River Valley into the Adriatic. You want to know, of course, the Tiber River, which is where Rome is situated. The Adriatic Sea on the back side of the boot. We've got the Tyrrhenian Sea on the front side of the boot. And of course, the Mediterranean Sea is the larger body of water that all these smaller seas are a part of. And lastly, of course, as I already mentioned, 2 major mountain ranges that you'll want to be familiar with. To the north, separating from the greater European landmass, of course, is the Alps Mountains. And then running the spine of the peninsula is the Apennine Mountains. Let's zoom in to the city of Rome itself. It's going to be founded on 7 hills. 7 hills. You can see the names of all of them there. And the Tiber River runs right through all of these. And the Tiber River is going to flow into the Tyrrhenian Sea. It's going to help with trade and commerce and communication with the rest of the peninsula and the greater world around them. But the 7 hills of Rome, very important: Capitoline Hill, the Quirinian, the Viminal, the Palatine, the Esquiline, the Caeline, and the Aventine. There's a couple of, just to kind of orient you, there's a couple of major constructions. You've heard of the Roman Forum. It's going to be located between the Capitoline and Palatine Hill. You've heard of the Circus Maximus, where all of the horse racing, chariot racings take place. That's on the south side of the Palatine Hill. And then the Colosseum, which is going to be on the north side of the Palatine Hill. And here's a couple of pictures that will help you remember what they look like. This is the Roman Forum, and there it's located there. And we've got the Circus Maximus located here. And of course, the famous Colosseum, the amphitheater of Flavius, that's going to be located right here. So those are some major constructions that we'll be looking at and you'll become familiar with as we study. Let's look at the beginning of Rome. Now, from Virgil's Aeneid, a historian and writer from the 1st century BC, he tells about the Trojan War and a gentleman who survived by the name of Aeneas. And he and his followers and survivors will travel throughout in their adventures through the Mediterranean, end up at Carthage, where he will hook up with Queen Dido of the Carthaginians, but he will leave her and end up in the central part of Italy. Eventually, his descendants, being Romulus and Remus, will found the city of Rome. So this is sort of the history, according to Roman mythology, of how Rome was founded. Now, when you zoom into the story of Romulus and Remus, the way the story goes is that they were thrown as their twin brothers as infants into the river Tiber. They had been dumped there by their uncle, on the command of their uncle, who was afraid that they would try to take away his throne, which he had taken it away from the rightful king, his brother, Numitor. And so, afraid that his nephews would find vengeance for their father, who he had imprisoned. He had them killed, but the servant decided not to kill them, but rather to put them in a basket in the river. They were eventually found by a she-wolf, according to Roman legend, and they were nursed and then fed by a woodpecker. And not that woodpecker, that's Woody the woodpecker. And here's another artist rendition. You can see sort of like a Little Red Riding Hood version of the wolf in Grandma's cap and dress. And then you can see the infants there. You can see the woodpecker on the tree there to the left. I'm not sure what's going on with the umbrella and the other birds. Eventually, they will be found by a shepherd by the name of Faustulus, and he will take the infant babies to his home, where he and his wife, Acca Larentia, will raise the boys. Eventually, these boys will grow up and get revenge for their dad and restore him to the throne back at Alba Longa, and they'll decide to begin their own city and decide to do it where they had been found by the she-wolf on the Tiber River amongst the 7 hills that we now call Rome. They couldn't decide which hill to build the city. They each had a different idea. Romulus wanted to build it on the Palatine Hill. Remus wanted to build it on the Aventine Hill. They decided to use a very traditional method for determining the will of the gods called an augury. Essentially what that means is they would watch the pattern of birds and discern from their flights and their movements what the will of the gods were. And so they each decided to watch their hill that they had decided to build their cities on and see if they had any signs from the gods. Each of them decided they had seen a sign. Remus said, "I saw 6 birds, and therefore we should build it on the Aventine." But Romulus said, "Oh, I saw 12 birds, so we should build it on the Palatine." Remus said, "You may have seen more, but I saw mine first, so therefore they should start the city on the Aventine." And they both quarreled and couldn't decide. Romulus decided to begin building his city. He started building a wall. And after a while, Remus would just mock and sort of make fun of his brother's wall. And eventually he hopped over it like, "Oh, this is some significant wall. What a joke." And he hopped over it. And his brother, Romulus, became so angry that he struck Remus and killed him. And then he basically continued to build the city that we now call Rome. He became the first king of Rome. There you have it. Romulus, the founder of Rome. April 21st, 753 BC. That's a date you're going to want to know, 753 BC. Well, what are the real beginnings? That's sort of the mythological beginnings that we get from Roman history. But what's the real beginning of the Romans and the Roman civilization? Well, let's take a look again at our map here. First, I want you to notice we see Greece in red to the east of the Italian peninsula. So we've talked about the establishment of the Greek civilization. I want you to see in green on the northern and western part of the continent of Africa, this is the Carthaginian civilization. And again, they're on north part of Africa. They've got colonies throughout the western Mediterranean. You can see in Spain, off the islands to the east of Spain, you've got Corsica and Sardinia and Sicily. They even had some limited settlements and colonies on the Italian peninsula as well. Now, the Greeks also had some colonies on the Italian peninsula. They've got basically a good third of the Italian peninsula, the tip of the boot and the bottom half of the boot. You can see there in pink, as well as about 50% of the island of Sicily was part of the Greek colonies. You can also see that there were some Greek colonies in Corsica and Sardinia as well. This whole area was called the Magna Graecia, the greater part of Greece. But what was going on in the majority of the peninsula? Who were the native people who were part of this Italian peninsula? Well, in the central area, we had the Latins. This is where the Tiber River is. This is where Rome will be founded. This is where we get the name Latin from. To the north and west, we have the Etruscans, which again, the Romans would borrow heavily from their culture. To the north and east, we have the Umbrians, and then directly to the east, we have the Samnites. All of these and others, there were many other tribes, but these were the major tribal groups that made up the Italian peninsula. So you can see the Italian peninsula is home to various tribes. Greek and Carthaginian colonists also lived in Italy and Sicily. The Etruscans lived in the northwest part of the coast of Italy. And again, a group called the Latins are going to settle along the central western centered around 7 hills of the Tiber River. It is these Latins that will eventually merge into a single group and found the city of Rome and give us the Romans. Now, as mentioned a minute ago, the Romans will adopt and modify many cultural aspects from their neighbors, most significantly from the Etruscans and the Greeks. The Etruscans are going to give us a significant hydraulic engineering technology using a water channel called the cuniculus. It's a hard word to say. That word actually in Latin means rabbit. And so you're like, a rabbit would burrow a hole. This was basically a burrow or a hole. And they use this to be able to move water from one space to another for irrigation, to drain marshes, which the area around the hills, at the base of these hills, was very marshy. Disease could be a problem, and as they expanded, as the Romans expanded, they needed more territory, more land for farming and for building homes, and so they would drain this marshland in between the hills. Eventually, the Roman Forum will be built right where some of this marshland is. So that's a really important technology that the Etruscans will give them. They're going to give us the arch. The Romans are going to get the arch from them. The alphabet is going to come from the Etruscans, but they had borrowed that from the Greeks. And by the way, the Greeks had borrowed that from the Phoenicians. The Etruscans are also going to give the Romans gladiatorial combat, chariot racing, the toga, religious rites, architecture. Just a whole lot of stuff is going to come from the Etruscans. Very important people group. The Greeks, of course, most famously contributed their pantheon of gods to the Romans. The Romans will adopt their pantheon, mostly changing the names to the names of different Roman deities that they had. But they're going to adopt that from the Greeks. Also, their art is going to come from the Greeks. The Greeks are just going to be fabulous lovers and contributors of art, and the Romans will copy them significantly. And as we mentioned a minute ago, the alphabet is going to come to the Romans via the Etruscans from the Greeks. But again, the Greeks got it from the Phoenicians. So that's just a little bit of background to the beginning of Rome. What about the Roman monarchy? We said there were 3 periods of Roman history. The first one is the Roman monarchy. So let's dive into this just a little bit here. The very first king, as we mentioned, let me back up here. There were 7 kings of Rome, and you're not going to have to know all 7 kings, but I'm just going to quickly run through them. The first king you will need to know, of course, Romulus. He's the founder of Rome, according to legend, and he is going to rule for, 753, for about 40 or so years, and he will eventually give way to the next king, Numa Pompilius, from 715 to 672. Eventually, Tullius Hostilius will be the next king. The next one is Ancus Martius. These are wonderful pictures of these guys, who's going to reign from 642 to 616. Then the first Etruscan king will become king of the Roman monarchy, Lucius Tarquinius Priscus. He will be followed then by Severus Tullius, and then he will be followed by the very last and infamous king. You will want to know this name, the first name and the last name, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus. And as a result of his tyranny and his evil actions of his son, who is basically going to take advantage of the wife of another Roman citizen, and based on his actions, the people of Rome are going to say, we're done with the Etruscan kings. We want them out. And matter of fact, we're done with this whole king thing anyway. We don't trust an individual to reign over us. And this will eventually give us the Roman Republic. And here is one of many famous paintings showing the assault on Lucretia that will end the Roman monarchy. Now, listen, during the monarchy, many advancements in Roman civilization and the city of Rome will take place. And I'm just going to give you some highlights that you're going to want to be familiar with. First off, Romulus is going to form the Senate, with 100 men, and the equites, which is a lower class of nobility, with 300 men. And he's going to start this ruling body called the Senate, which will help advise the king. The king will rule for life, but he would be selected by the Senate. So that was an important idea. The Senate selected the king, but he did rule for life. He had ultimate and complete power and authority, again, using the Senate as advisors. The only thing the Senate could do is they had the ability to declare war. The king could not do that. During the monarchy, Rome began to develop as a city. Tribes and clans on the 7 hills eventually will assimilate into Rome. And then a major sewer drainage system called the Cloaca Maxima is going to be built in the valley between the Palatine and Capitoline hills under the Tarquins, draining the marshy area between these hills. Basically, they took a natural drainage channel and lined it with stones so that it would continue to drain water. But they eventually covered it with a top, an arch, so that water could flow through and people could walk over it. And eventually this became an underground sewer system, which was an incredible advancement for this city. This forum eventually will be built. The first version of the Circus Maximus is going to be built during the reign of Lucius Tarquinius Priscus. The temple Jupiter Optimus is going to be built by Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, the very last king of Rome. And then a very famous wall around the city, the Servian Wall, which is said to have been built by their 6th king, but we now know based on archaeology that it was actually built in the 4th century BC, likely was built on the remains of a wall built during the time of the monarchy. So the Servian Wall, which again was built 4th century, so well after the monarchy into the Republic. Earlier, we thought historians thought it had come from the 6th king, but it turns out that wall was built on the remains of a wall from the monarchy. So a lot of significant advancements happening here in Rome during the monarchy. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, wanting to get rid of the kings, especially the Tarquinian king Lucius Tarquinius, Lucretius is going to kill herself, desiring to set a noble example for other women and not wanting to live with the shame of what had happened to her. So it's from this, after the Tarquinians had fled, that the Roman Republic will be born. So let's look very quickly at the Roman family and society. Very important thing you'll need to know is the paterfamilias. The paterfamilias, he is the head of the family, but not just the immediate family, not just like mom and kids, wife and kids. He was in charge with complete authority over the entire household. This include extended family, slaves, anybody who lived within their home. He was considered the head of that, and he was given control even over life and death within his own family. These families formed clans formed tribes within Roman society. The patricians, there's going to be 2 groups that are going to basically fall here in the formation of Roman society. The patricians, these are the wealthy, land-controlling noble families that are going to exercise immense influence and power in Roman society. The majority of the people, though, were plebeians. These were the inferior or common people. So 2 classes of society will develop, patricians and plebeians. You're going to want to know those. A couple of pictures of some home situations they've got going. The first one is an apartment complex called an insulae. Insula is the word in Latin for island, and so an insulae was basically a construction that was surrounded by roads. It was basically separated by roads from other construction, so it was an island unto itself. It was often made out of wood, mud brick, and concrete. And there were multiple levels and stories to an insulae. You can see this cross-section of one here. At the street level, the bottom rooms were basically markets and places that people could shop, buy food. People were carrying on their commerce and trade. And above these were the places that people lived in little apartments. The more to-do or well-off people would be on the lower floors, but as you got higher up, the homes became smaller and not as nice. So if you had a little bit more money, you were closer to the first floor. Now, if you were really wealthy, you had a domus inside of Rome. This is a very fancy house that had an atrium, it had a peristyle or an inside garden and a courtyard. This was a very nice house. you can see here again a cross-section of the interior of this domus, but it's a beautiful house. You had water features, statues of your relatives, a place for the husband or the paterfamilias to conduct business. He had servants and slaves who helped do the cooking and take care of the children and family chores. He might have shops along the road that he could conduct business outside of the domus. So that was a nice home inside, a wealthy home inside the city of Rome. But what if you had a lot of money, you really were wealthy, if you could have a villa? And this was a country estate, basically like a domus, but much larger usually, much more significantly built, put together, lots of ornate decorations, statues, water features, usually some agricultural fields or orchards associated with this this construction here. And again, you can kind of see this cross section of the villa. Now here's some samplings of what different Romans sort of wore in their clothing. You can see the patricians and plebeians definitely dressed very differently. The patricians wore togas and nice robes with beautiful colors. The plebeians have a tendency to be wearing simple tunics and overcoats. Additional parts of Roman society, of course, you had the consuls and the magistrates. These were political figures, and you can see how beautifully dressed they are, very ornate. We'll talk more about the consuls in a little bit in a minute. You can see the priestly class there on the left side. There will be priests and their assistants. And then, of course, here's how many wealthy Roman women dressed in the lower right corner. Now, as we mentioned earlier, the earliest form of governments from the Latins was a monarchy. It will be dominated by the Etruscans. The king was the chief priest, army commander, administrator of justice. He was elected by the people in the Senate to the office of king for life, and he relied on this council of leaders to provide him with counsel, the Senate. He was given a purple toga to wear, red shoes, a special chair to sit upon, and he was given an axe bundled up with some sticks called a fasces, which symbolized his authority and power. The monarchy again ran from 753 to 509, 7 different kings. The final 3 would be Etruscan kings, as we mentioned, but they will be overthrown in 509 BC. The Republic born in 509 running to about 31 BC. And from this, we're going to get the Republic, which had 3 branches of government: the consuls, the Senate, and the assemblies. Let's quickly look at what these distinctions were. The consuls were 2 individuals elected from the Senate class to serve 1 year. They did this for just 1 year so that they would not become too powerful. And since there were 2 of them, one was not able to act without the other consul. So these were sort of checks and balances on the power and authority and the longevity of leadership for the consuls. They were the commanders of the army, supreme judges. They controlled the everyday affairs of the Republic. And then you had the Senate, which was, again, made up of the patrician class, the wealthy landowners. And they were appointed by life by the consuls. They legislated laws. They drove foreign policy, controlled the finances. So if you wanted to become a senator, you had to get on the good side of a consul and get him to appoint you as a senator. And once that happened, you were there for life. Now, the assemblies were the people. These are based on family status, etc., that made up assemblies and voted on laws, made declarations of war that could be vetoed by the Senate. So the assemblies were lower than the senators, but still not the normal, regular, everyday plebes were a part of this. This was still more upper-class Roman citizens. But they make up the most basic assemblies of the political structure of Rome. Here is a picture of a couple of consuls, and you can see the fasces. That is the symbol of their authority and power in the background. Here's a picture of the Senate building with the senators, and you can see a senator orating and giving a speech, trying to get his fellow senators to move on some sort of action. Now, the plebeians, as I mentioned, had no authority or power. But eventually plebeians, because they revolted and fought for this, they were given the right to elect some tribunes that would help govern them, give them a voice. Eventually this led to Roman law famously being inscribed on 12 tablets or 12 tables and placed in the middle of the Roman Forum, which is the center of Rome. This was really important because this gave the law a fixture, a permanency. It's hard to take away people's rights if their rights are printed in, or I should say engraved in stone and visible for everybody to see. It's hard for the powerful class to deny rights of the lower class when everybody knows what their rights are. So having them posted for all to see was a huge step forward for the plebeians. Eventually, the plebeians were able to have their own assembly to help give them authority and representation. And here's a couple of images showing the 12 tables in the Forum. Now, the Roman Republic. The Latins of Rome are going to consolidate their power. We're going to talk about how we got to the Roman Republic. Well, the Latins of Rome consolidated their power and unified the various Latin tribes in central Italy. They're eventually going to overthrow and absorb the Etruscans, and they will basically overrun the Greek colonies in the south. And then once these Latins, or now Romans, are able to unite and control the Italian peninsula, they're going to turn their attention to dominating the western portion of the Mediterranean Sea with a series of wars, first against the the Carthaginians, what we call the Punic Wars, and then they're going to move their attention east to the Greeks. Their biggest competitor, however, was the Carthaginians, and that was who they needed to deal with first. So they're going to engage in a series of wars from about 246 to 146 BC. Now here we go. Here we can see what Rome or Italy looks like with all the various tribes. The Latins are going to expand and unify the central part of the Italian peninsula. Eventually they're going to kick out the kick out the Greek colonists. The Carthaginians will have done the same thing in Sicily, Corsica, and Sardinia. So now it's really just down to the Romans and the Carthaginians battling it out for the West. So let's take a look at these Punic Wars. Here we go, Punic Wars. There we go. The first one's 264. The last one is going to end in 146 BC. So again, vying for control. Oh, I need to mention this. The Punic is the Roman for Phoenician. Carthage had actually been founded by the Phoenicians. You remember them from the eastern part of the Mediterranean Sea. The Phoenicians were the purple people. They created the color purple by using dye from shells that they got underwater there off the coast of Palestine and Israel. And so they had founded colonies throughout the Mediterranean, and one of them was Carthage. So the Romans called them the Punics from Phoenician. So the Punic Wars, this is, again, Rome vying for control of Western Mediterranean, will bring them into conflict with Carthage, fighting 3 wars between 264 and 146. You can see the dates there. But eventually, they're going to win control over Sicily first in the First Punic War. The Second Punic War, Carthage is going to go on the attack against a Roman ally in Spain, which will kick off that Second War. Now, this is the one I really want us to focus in on, just a few details. A guy that you're going to want to know is by the name of Hannibal. This is a Carthaginian general, and he's actually going to take his army from Spain with elephants over a snow-covered Alps mountain range and surprise the Romans. This was going to be a huge shock and surprise, and those elephants were like ancient battle tanks. It's hard for foot soldiers to withstand a charging herd of elephants. And so he's going to basically ravage the Roman countryside, devastating their cities and villages. Never directly attacks Rome itself, but the Senate has to send armies out. They're actually going to get completely annihilated at the Battle of Cannae. An entire legion is lost, and Rome is in a panic, not knowing what's going to happen here. They're going to elect a general by the name of Scipio to basically force Hannibal's hand to retreat, because he's going to go on the attack at Carthage itself. This will force Hannibal home, and Scipio will defeat Hannibal at the famous Battle of Zama, ending the Second Punic War. Eventually, there will be a third one from 149 to 146. Carthage will fail to keep up some of its promises from the end of the previous war, and Rome will use this as a pretext to completely destroy Carthage and turn it into the Roman province of Africa. And you can see two famous busts of the Roman general Scipio. He will be given the title Africanus for his victory in Africa, so we often refer to him as Scipio Africanus. And then, of course, Hannibal, the Carthaginian general. There we go. That's from the Second Punic War. So you want to know that detail. That's kind of an important detail. Second Punic War, Hannibal and Scipio. Here's a famous picture of the elephants crossing the Alps. And here's a little map that shows some of the significant battles during the Second Punic War. Feel free to study that and look at that at your leisure. Now, at the end of all of this, you can see this leaves Rome in control of the western portion of the Mediterranean Sea. Now, to the east, as time has moved on, the Greek Empire had taken over the Persian Empire and with Alexander the Great. But at his death at 323 BC, his empire had been split amongst several generals, three of which were interested here. The Macedonia territory and Greek mainland will be in control by the Greek general Antigonus, and the Syrian Mesopotamian territory, the Anatolia Peninsula, will be in control by the Greek general Seleucus, and then the Egyptian territory will be in control by the Greek general Ptolemy. So it's basically Rome on the west and these Greek generals to the east, and Rome is not just settled with just the western portion of the Mediterranean. They're going to want to move east. But before we deal with more advancements, we've got some reform and civil war that's going to take place first. The first group of reforms is going to take place because as Rome has expanded its control over various territories and become powerful, they're going to be struggling internally with corruption, which is going to be really their undoing. The soldier farmers who had lost their farms and land while fighting for Rome became homeless, impoverished, and restless. Basically, the way this worked, if you were a farmer and they called up legions, you had to go fight. And you could be gone for years while your wife and family had to try to take care of the land, farm the land. If they could not continue to farm the land, they could lose it to the people who owned the land, who they were renting from, who owned the notes on it, so to speak, because they couldn't pay their bills. And so wealthy patrician families were getting rich, accumulating land, and these farmers, when they came home, they would find that they had lost their homes and their families were either gone or homeless living in a city somewhere. So you just had a whole bunch of people who were homeless, impoverished, and restless. They couldn't farm, couldn't find jobs because the Romans loved to collect slaves and sell them. And so this was a huge reason why they went to war, which was to collect slaves. It was a very big money-making thing for them, unfortunately. And this left them without the opportunity, the poor plebeians, to find ways to provide for their families. So there's going to be a lot of unrest. An aristocratic noble family who controlled the Senate, or I should say aristocratic noble families, again, who controlled the Senate, grew more wealthy at the expense of the poor and ignored their pleas for change. Two brothers, the Gracchi brothers, are going to try to take some things into their own hands and try to bring some reforms. Another reform is going to come from Marius a few years later. Let's look at the Gracchi brothers' efforts first. They are a pair of brothers, Tiberius Gracchus and Gaius Gracchus. Each were elected as tribune of the plebes and attempted to make some social and legal reforms. These, of course, were opposed by the majority of the Senate because the wealthy landowners didn't want any change. Tiberius would be clubbed to death along with 300 of his supporters in 133 BC. What a terrible tragedy that was. And then his brother Gaius committed suicide in 121 BC, fearing his imminent death. 3,000 of his own supporters were executed soon after. So, as you can imagine, the early effort at reforms by the Gracchi brothers went up in smoke. It went nowhere. Now, we're going to end up with a series of 3 civil wars that's going to take place over the course of about 100 years. The first one is going to be Marius versus Sulla. And by the way, Sulla wins, Marius loses. Let's look at a little bit more detail on this one here. The first civil war, again, fought by Marius and Sulla. Marius is a military hero. He's well liked by the people. He really wants to make some changes. He does make some significant changes within the army, creating what's called a professional army. This had been new. Previously, it was just farmers and regular citizens who would be soldiers, and they would be called up from their normal everyday tasks to come fight. However, he said, you know what? We need to have a professional standing army. And these guys will get land and money for fighting for Rome. And we will help provide their equipment, their training, etc., pay them. And so this was a pretty significant reform. This is going to make him very popular with the people. However, Sulla, another army commander, is going to be very supportive and supported by the Senate and the wealthy class. So these two are going to go head-to-head against one another, as Marius wants to institute some reforms that will be benefiting the plebes and the common people. This does not go over very well. Marius will lose, and the Senate will continue its dominance. Second civil war will happen as a result of a conglomerate of political relationships called the First Triumvirate. Crassus, Pompey, and Julius Caesar will form this first triumvirate, and Julius Caesar will end up being the winner after a civil war breaks out amongst the three of them. Let's take a look at a little bit more detail. Julius Caesar, of course, famously had been a general expanding Roman influence and control of Gaul, Britannia, and he had been writing for years back to Rome about his exploits, and consequently had become very popular with the people of Rome, but also greatly supported by his legions that he had control over. Crassus and Pompey were also very important men. Crassus was very wealthy, probably the most wealthy person in Rome. He was a general, as was Pompey. And they're going to decide to get together, not because they liked one another, but because they needed each other to advance their own political agendas and wanted to try to control Rome, but they couldn't do it by themselves. So they make this political alliance called the First Triumvirate, meaning three-man rule. Crassus will die tragically in battle, making a very dumb decision to attack someplace he shouldn't have. We'll study that later, maybe. This will leave Pompey, who had the support of the Senate, and Julius Caesar, who again is going to have the support of the people. And they will eventually fight for control, and Julius Caesar will be on top. And he will make himself dictator for life. Now, the Senate's not going to be too happy about that, and fearing their loss of control and power, are going to, as you see here, attack Julius Caesar, and they're going to assassinate him on March 15th, 44 BC. Let's look at a little bit more detail on what this looks like. The Senate and Pompey are going to be concerned about Caesar's power and influence, and they're going to want to check his power, and this is when that civil war erupts. Again, Julius Caesar will defeat Pompey, who will flee to Egypt and be killed by a Ptolemaic Egyptian official hoping to please Caesar. Caesar is going to make himself dictator for life, working to bring reforms for the common people. And again, the senators, threatened by his popularity, fearing his power, will assassinate him on the Ides of March. Well, what's going to happen as a result of that? Well, we're going to end up with a third civil war, but before we have our third civil war, we're going to have our second triumvirate. This is made up of Marcus Antonius, Marcus Lepidus, and Octavian, the adopted son and nephew of Julius Caesar. They will form the second triumvirate and eventually fall into a third civil war with Octavian being on top. Let's dive into just a few details here. Octavian will join forces with Mark Antony to punish those who killed him. They're going to get revenge. Eventually, they're going to divide the empire up, Octavian to the west and Antony to the east. But again, these two are very ambitious, and this will spark the third civil war. Antony will ally himself with Cleopatra, the queen of Egypt, and eventually they will meet at the famous Battle of Actium in 31 BC, a naval battle, which they will be soundly defeated by Octavian's navy. They will commit suicide at the end of this, leaving Octavian in command of Rome. He will become the sole ruler of Rome and become its very first imperator or emperor. The Roman Republic is officially over, though it's been over for quite a bit, but we're going to now start the Roman Empire, which will last from about 27 BC to about 476 AD, the collapse of the Roman Empire. So here's a quick synopsis of the three civil wars: Marius versus Sulla, Julius Caesar versus Crassus and Pompey, and Octavian versus Mark Antony. There we go. So what do we have now? The end of all of this, the end of the Roman Republic. Let's go on to the next. There we go. The end of the Roman Republic. We have Octavian as the final leader. Having taken control over the Western Mediterranean by the second mid-century BC, Rome turns its attention to the eastern portion. Macedonia, Syria, and Egypt were the three territories controlled by the descendants of Alexander the Great's generals. Rome will defeat the Macedonians, absorb Greece into its territories by 146. In 64 to 63 BC, Roman General Pompey will take control over Syria and Israel. And in 30 BC, Augustus will defeat Antony and the Egyptian queen Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium. And this brings Egypt under Roman control. So by the end of the first century BC, Rome has control over the entire Mediterranean Sea. And it is truly Mare Nostra, or our sea. And that's what Rome looks like, or the Mediterranean world looks like, at the end of the first century BC. All right, that'll do it for us on our study of Roman civilization.